Good evening, and welcome to a conversation with NPR science correspondent Nell Greenfieldboyce and KPCC science reporter Jacob Margolis. It's a conversation discussing some of the issues that science reporters face, including how to handle issues of distrust in science and how to make a complex subject accessible to the public. I'm Danny Sway, Senior Membership Manager here at KPCC. These events and everything here at KPCC is made possible because of you, our listener, and your generous member support. And I just wanted to thank you for being a member and helping events like these come to life. Tonight, we are together in a Zoom webinar with a question and answer function enabled. If you have any questions for Nell or Jacob throughout the next 45 minutes or so, please type them in the chat and hopefully we'll get to them. We'll also have some time at the end for additional questions, but enough about me. Without further ado, here is Nell Greenfieldboyce and Jacob Margolis.
Hi, everybody. Thanks so much for coming. I really appreciate it. And Nell, it's great to see you again. So
I'm thrilled to be here. Thank you for inviting me.
Yeah. So, we're going to talk about a few things tonight, and believe it or not, I guess I'll start off with this. We've been listening to Nell's amazing work on NPR since like 2005. So almost 20 years or so. I mean,
not quite 20.
Not quite 20. No, just short of 20. But you've been a staple of NPR for a while and have always admired your work. And we're going to talk about the act of finding the most compelling science stories, what it takes to make seemingly boring science stories more interesting. We'll hear some of Nell's work, and we're going to get a chance to talk about issues of science literacy, anti-science movements, and what it's like working as a science reporter during this time. We're going to go for about an hour or so. And like Danny mentioned, if you have any questions as we go along, please type them into the chat box and we'll kind of collate them. And as we go through, I will ask Nell, or at the end, we'll have a 15-minute Q&A session just with the audience, depending on how many come up and in what part of the conversation. So without further ado, I would love to get started. And I would love to start at the beginning with you, Nell. Talk a little bit about your background, because I'm sure people are curious what it takes to be a science reporter. So can you tell us a bit about how you got started in journalism and what drove you to cover science?
Well, I didn't think I was going to be a journalist. I thought I was going to be a scientist. And I think that's true for a lot of people who end up in science journalism, although there are a fair number of different routes to get into it. But I fully thought that I was going to be working in a laboratory, probably an environmental or a biology lab, and everything I did as a student was geared towards that. I did summer internships at university labs when I was a high school student, and I entered college as a biology major. And I just found that I did not actually like doing lab work. I did not like sitting in the laboratory working on one project for a long time, which is what you have to do when you're a scientist. And sometimes the way experiments were planned isn't how they work. I think a lot of scientists are quite fiddly. They like to fiddle with things and to, sort of like, they're very sort of object oriented. And, I probably would have been drawn to field work, but I was never really exposed to any of that. And so I was, stuck a little bit where I had this real interest in science, but not so much an interest in doing it, more an interest in talking about it, talking with the graduate students in the laboratory, that sort of thing. And the university where I went, Johns Hopkins, just happened to have at that time a program in science writing. It was a very small program in a writing department that was really more about fiction and literary nonfiction and poetry. But they did have some classes in science writing with a professor named Ann Finkbeiner. And so I took those and I realized this is awesome. Like, I just get to talk to scientists about the really cool stuff they're doing, and I don't have to actually do it. I can just pick all the best parts, the most interesting parts, and learn about those, and then like move on to the next thing. And it just really spoke to something in me, and it's turned out rather well. Because I loved every aspect of it. I love talking to the scientists. I love digging for news. I love doing the reporting that involves public records. I also enjoy playing with tape now that I'm in radio. I like, playing with the sounds. And so for me, it just worked out great. I feel like I lucked out. I sort of stumbled into a job that is uniquely satisfying for me. And if I have my way, I am just going to keep keep going until NPR kicked me out.
And so you worked for magazines early on, or newspapers early on, and then so you were doing print, and then you eventually transitioned to NPR, like we said, in 2005. So what was it like going from, and we're gonna get into the topic of choosing stories, identifying what works for what platform and whatnot. What was it like making that transition, writing for a print publication, and all of a sudden now you have to gather audio and put stuff out over air?
Yeah, so I always worked, I spent the first 10 years of my career working exclusively in print, mostly for weekly magazines, which don't really exist very much anymore, right? Like the idea of a weekly magazine that you would wait a week to get your news and then have it delivered, printed on dead trees seems so quaint now, but they were a big deal. And I came into radio because print was contracting and a lot of reporters were losing their jobs at the same time that NPR was hiring. And honestly, I had never really been a huge listener to radio. I mean, I sort of did, but not like some people are, where they grew up with public radio being part of their life. It just wasn't something my family did. And so it was a real transition. Like it was a real nightmare. Like when I came to NPR, they told me, oh, it's going to take you at least a year, probably more, to like get the hang of radio. And I thought coming into it like, oh, yeah, that's such a joke. Of course, that won't take me that long. I mean, I feel like I'm still kind of getting the hang of it. It's just a completely different medium. It's so different in your brain, the way you have to process information and how to present it. And I feel like print is more akin to writing a letter to your friend. It has the sort of same approach that you might use when you're writing a letter to a friend. But a good radio story is almost like a puppet show. You know what I mean? You have like characters coming in and out and like scene changes. And it's much more theatrical than print was. And that was never something I had any experience in. And just, the idea that I had to go report my stories and write them, and then the writer in me would feel like I was done, but I wasn't done. I had to go effectively perform them, like get in front of a microphone and like put on a show. It's like, to me, it was a very difficult transition. And I think when people are listening to radio, it's so seamless and the information just like goes into your brain and it seems so simple, but actually, if it's done well, getting that sort of like seamless line of information going, it's extraordinarily hard. It's challenging for me still. Every time I do a story, I'm just like, oh my God, how am I going to do this? I have like all this tape and like all this stuff. And it's just like, you could do it a million different ways. You have oftentimes to do a longer story, you have hours and hours and hours of tape. And you have to like distill it all down into like maybe like 5 minutes if you're lucky, and so it's so different. It's just a completely different beast. And I find it kind of thrilling, actually. And, these days, everything is done multiple ways, right? So I'll do a story for radio, and then I'll do a story for our website, which is technically the same story. But if you compare them, they're so different. They have different people quoted. They start in different ways. They have different information is in one and not in the other. And it's just entirely because of these mediums. And I did not know what I was getting into. I really didn't. I really had no clue what I was getting into. I was like, oh, how different could it be?
Yeah, I find it especially difficult when you have, say, a science story that you have to tie together multiple findings to make to justify the existence of the piece that you're currently doing. And so I think I've learned over time that I just try to avoid those, especially if I have to just do short 60-second spots on them, obviously. So I am curious about how you identify and move forward with stories. We talked in our conversation before this briefly about there's kind of study stories. There are more enterprise stories that you end up doing, but you can also make study stories more enterprise. And so I am curious, when you're looking around, can you walk us through a bit of that process for how you find your ideas, and then I would love to talk a bit about how you move forward and execute on them. And we do have some examples that we obviously will be playing as well.
Well, I'm sure you come across this. There is so much science going on at any one time. I mean, we are inundated with press releases from scientific journals and universities, right? I mean, Jacob, I'm guessing your inbox is just filled with emails that like you barely have time to read, but they just come from everywhere. They come from all the science agencies and like all the major journals, and then all the smaller journals, and then the scientific meetings. And then just like, then there's just areas of science that just kind of like happen, right? Like, you know, like who could have predicted the COVID outbreak, you know, that would become such a, you know, sort of world-changing, life-altering event that basically every science reporter suddenly was reporting on coronaviruses, right? So sometimes stuff just, it's not a choice. You're not making a choice. It's like stuff happens and, you know, a volcano erupts or something. And, you know, so suddenly you're learning about, you know, magma. And
that's my favorite is the breaking news, because the mission is so clear. The story is so clear. But when you're doing some of these more complicated pieces, it becomes, you know, it becomes more complicated and a lot more breaking down.
I mean, sometimes there's no choice. You just, you know, you walk in the newsroom and there's like a gaggle of editors. And when you walk in, they turn and look at you. And that's like a bad sign. That means something's happened. I remember once that happened to me and they were like, oh, Nell, we're thinking we want you to cover this space rock that just fell over Russia. And I was like, oh yeah, I can do that. No problem. Today, you know, for all things considered, all right. And I walked back to my desk and I'm like, what space rock? Like, I just hadn't heard about it, you know, like it happened like when I was on my way to work. Some, you know, meteorite boom and was like, you know, like setting off car alarms and breaking windows and stuff like that. So sometimes it's not a choice. Sometimes it just, it literally falls in your lap practically. But when it is a choice, for me, I have some guidelines that I sort of use when I'm trying to evaluate a story. One is the extent to which it touches on or is related to the kind of basic science that we all learned as kids and got exposed to in elementary school. Because for a lot of people who don't go on to pursue a career in the sciences, like that is what they know about science. Like that is their background. And so if you mess with any of that, or if there's something related to any of that, people tend to be interested. It's why people got so emotional about Pluto, right? Because we all had to memorize the planets. And so if you're going to get rid of Pluto, it's like, no. I had to memorize that. Pluto is a planet. Mrs. So-and-so taught me in second grade. Like people got really involved in that. There's like strong feelings in the public that otherwise is pretty, you know, neutral on the other planets, right? But the Pluto example gets to another thing that I think about in looking for a good science story for the public. And that is the Pluto, the idea of being kind of like rejected or an outcast, you know, it speaks to something in us. It's our secret fear. All of us have that as the secret fear that we're going to be like, sort of like, you know, cast out. And so when I look at science stories, I'm often looking to see, does this story touch on universal themes, sort of universal human themes, you know, whatever they are, whether they're like our struggles against our own mortality or our finite lifespans or struggles with our parents or, you know, overcoming like big obstacles or something like that, or just, you know, the random chances of fate, right? Like the way luck just plays this sort of outsized influence in our life. So whenever I'm looking at stories, I'm like, all right. Is this going to be a good story? Is it going to be a good yarn for people who are just not necessarily even into science? So to me, that's like a big draw. And then I guess besides sort of like the news that really happens, the sort of like more human stories of science, the other things I look for are watchdog role type stories, right? So there's a lot of stories in the world that have a science component, and, you know, government agencies and people trying to skew science for their own interests. So I think science reporters have to play that kind of watchdog role in the same way that every kind of reporter does. And the last thing would be stories about just how crazy and weird nature is and the universe is. And people like those stories. And I think that they like them for a reason. It's just a reminder that there's so much we don't know and we're so tiny compared to everything else. And I think that when people are driving to work or doing dishes in their kitchen and they're just being inundated with all these stories about, important stories about social issues and politics and economics and stuff, like it's nice to think about, other galaxies or black holes or, just something that would be a break, frankly, from a lot of the day to day.
Yeah, I was, as you were talking about Pluto and also what you just mentioned, I was actually thinking about, I was also thinking about their anthropomorphization of different things, of different, specifically the rovers up on Mars. I remember Opportunity's life came to an end, and that was probably one of the most engaged with stories that we did. And obviously, the rover doesn't have feelings, but the people that did work on Opportunity did, and we definitely project a lot of feelings onto the rover. But I felt like a lot of people absolutely connected with Oppie's journey. And I found that to be, it was actually really touching. And it was really beautiful to see people connect with, an unfeeling robot on Mars. And so I'm curious, like when you're going to go ahead and relate something really big, say in space, are you going to use anthropomorphization at all to help people relate, like as a tool to some of these things? Do you use, I have an example of a recent story that you did with whales, actually, that I really liked, kind of like breaking stuff down to a certain, I guess, level. Yeah, there we go. So I love this story for a number of reasons, and this is an anthropomorphization, but I would like to talk a bit about it. And so the headline is obviously the biggest whales can eat the equivalent of 80,000 Big Macs in one day, which is quite a few Big Macs. And it's a fascinating piece in the journal Nature about how some whales eat some 20 to 50 million calories per day, I believe. And so I want to talk about some of the language and the headlines, the sort of the teaser up top. Can you talk a little bit about why you ended up comparing, instead of going with 20 to 50 million calories, going with that 80 million Big Macs? And I don't know if you wrote the headline, but I thought it was important. It was in the piece, so I assume you
did. Yeah. I did write the headline. This was a complicated piece. I mean, it was a story about trying to assess how much whales actually eat in the wild. So the story was about how much do big whales eat in the wild. So the headline's legit. I mean, that's what they found, that a blue whale in the eastern North Pacific, on the days when it's feeding, it takes in that much food. And that was the major finding from the study, is that these big baleen whales on average eat like 3 times more than scientists had estimated before. Mm-hmm. And so, but there's tons of like more subtle things about the study, about the relationship between how much they eat and how much they poop and what that does to the krill they eat, and like all these complicated things. And so, but I was just trying to think, like, if I was a person, what would be the thing that might get their attention, right? Like you're looking on the internet and you're sort of scrolling around, and what's the headline going to be? It's going to be like, scientists find whales eat more than they thought. I mean, that's kind of interesting, right? But I don't think anybody has a conception of how much whales eat, right? Like, so I don't know. I mean, I just wrote that because I thought it was funny. And I just, every time scientists give me numbers, like especially big numbers, the big numbers are meaningless to people. Like, people really can't imagine a million of anything. And then when you start to talk about billions and trillions, like, forget about it. You might as well just be saying sounds that have no meaning. At least me. I guess some people are really mathematically oriented, but I don't know. So you're always trying to think, like, can you compare it to a swimming pool? Can you compare it to the Empire State Building? Like, what are some actual, I remember talking about a spacecraft that had to land in basically like something the size of a parking space. Do you know what I mean? Like, and I feel like that's good because people have trouble getting into parking spaces, right? Like, just at your shopping center, right? Much less if you're out on some asteroid, like, and you're some little robot landing yourself. So I do think it's important to use visual, meaningful language when writing about things, because, I don't know. You know what was interesting about that story, though? no whale sounds. I really tried to find some whale sounds, and like their measurements that they did. So the big thing this study did was it used acoustical measurements to look at the density and size of the swarms of krill that these whales were lunging into. And so they used sound waves to like measure these things. But
Perfect
I was like,
for radio.
Exactly. But they didn't have any of those sound files. And then when I went to try to find some sounds of whales, they didn't have any of feeding. I don't know. I looked at it for a while and then I was like, all right, I just got to move on. But normally, I mean, a whale sound, that's like killer radio, right? Like,
yeah, it'd be the first thing I look for.
sounds?
Yeah, absolutely. The first thing I write in my script. I mean, and in the story, you really dive into the fertilizer and the whale poop coming out, acting as fertilizer, high iron, all this. It's a really fascinating and complicated story. How did you decide that this, and this is one of the story, this is what I would call a study story generally. How did you decide that this study story, which they can be oftentimes, and we should talk a little bit more about like the struggle with studies. They're often very limited in scope. They often don't give us big, humongous takeaways. And I think that a mistake the media generally, I mean, I hate saying the media, but the media can generally make is extrapolating too much from one study that does come out. But how did you decide? That's not what happened with this. And so how did you decide that this was going to be worthy of like a pretty thorough breakdown?
Well, because I think that the biggest animals ever to have lived on the earth are intrinsically interesting because people like big things. And the fact that they eat little things, like, again, this like harkens back to what people learn in school. I think a lot of people learn in school that these giant whales filter feed on these tiny little krill, right? So like already people are kind of invested in this information because they know something about whales in the way they don't know something about, pick some other random creature, wombats or something. Do you know what I mean? And I think, how much whales eat is pretty directly tied to, how can we help their populations, grow, and, whether they can bounce back from the mass slaughter from the whale hunting in the last 200 years. So there's pretty clear kind of like implications for the study. So like there's a certain amount of kind of like, gee whiz, these animals are really so big, but there are actual like implications for like, what does this mean about ocean conservation? And, what does it mean when you hunt the Earth's biggest, beasts, basically almost to extinction. So, I mean, that's kind of what I thought. And, because you're a science reporter, but a lot of people don't know is that there are major science journals like Science, Nature, Cell, Current Biology, and they all send reporters advanced copies of their table of contents. So, as a reporter, you're kind of looking through all the sort of news of the week. Like, okay, these are all the big studies that are going to come out. Of this, is there anything that you think rises to a story that you would want to do for the public? And a lot of the studies are incremental studies. So it's like, we've found a galaxy that is the farthest galaxy away that we've ever seen. And it's like, all right, but like, how much further is it than what was the farthest galaxy before? Is like not much further, you know what I mean? And like, so for the scientists, like that's a big find. But for the average public, do they really care that a galaxy is like 80 million light years farther when like they didn't even know these galaxies existed? And like, how does it affect them that they found a further away galaxy? So, there's a lot of science out there that for scientists, for their field, is moving the field along, is like, taking little steps forward. But for the public, it doesn't have the sort of emotional or practical or sort of storytelling aspect. But, I'll do a story on a very minor study if it's a good yarn, if it's a fun story, even if the results aren't that exciting, especially if it reveals something about the nature of science and the way scientists do their work. Because I think scientists are an interesting breed. And I think that the way they think about the world and the way they approach problems is sometimes inherently interesting even if they don't have all the answers, or even if it's a really esoteric, thing. But it can be pretty darn esoteric. And if the public has some emotional connection to it, that's enough. Like matter, nobody knows what antimatter is, or matter, or whatever, but we've all heard about like Star Trek and stuff like that. People are like invested in antimatter in a way that you would be surprised, really. So, it can be pretty esoteric, honestly. But if it's not if it's just an incremental step in science that isn't gonna grab the reader or the listener, we wouldn't do it. And it doesn't mean it's not good science. It just means it's not good for us to do at that time.
I would say that for me recently, trying to do more and more stories that look into the impacts of climate change on public health, and wanting very specific data about, say, the impact of, one of the things I was looking at was the impact of wildfire smoke on certain populations within, parts of LA. When you get to population level impacts of climate related events, it's tough. For one, medical stuff, there's strict laws around it, but also a lot of the studies that come out are very limited in scope. And so you have to do quite a bit of work to expand it beyond the study. And unless you have a newsroom that's going to support you, I guess requesting records from every hospital in 300 zip codes or whatever, which would take forever, it can be really tough to draw those kind of conclusions that you want to find for, say, the impact of wildfire smoke on populations. And so when it comes to,
and I think that's,
sorry.
So I think that's a good example of how the sort of study story, the sort of what's coming out in the journals this week is a very limited way of doing science reporting, honestly. And I think most journalists I know who cover science, they look at the sort of news that's percolating up through the studies and are they almost hope there's nothing in there they have to cover, because they'd rather work on the more ambitious, time-consuming, but usually more interesting to the public stories, where you have a question that's just come up in your mind, what is the effect of the smoke, and you have to go looking for the best available information. There's probably not a study that exactly answers what you want to know, right?
For the smoke, it was there was one study, and I talked to the author, and we looked at this one hospital in Los Angeles because we could only get the data from this one hospital for this one very specific set of codes too, because that's how they pull medical data. But I will ask, since we're on the topic of studies, and one of the favorite things that people like to say at parties is, I read a study that said X, Y, and Z. For the people that are listening, when you are going, are there some red flags that you look out for when actually assessing a study or reading another study story from someone else? Any recommendations that you can give to folks in order to help them be a bit more critical when it comes to assessing their own research?
Well, I mean, we used to joke that we had a bulletin board at the science desk called "Good News for Mice," right? There's just how many things have been cured in mice, right? We're very skeptical of a mouse study purporting to show anything, right? Because again, good science, important science, but it's in mice.
Part of it's the journal. Maybe part of it's the journal too. It depends on which journal it ends up in, or.
Oh yeah. Well, on the other hand, I think that the big journals are just as susceptible to wanting to have a cool story as anybody else, right? I mean, there's a lot of stuff that gets published. Just because it's published in a major journal, you can't assume that it's legit. I think that study size, if it's a clinical study, how many people were involved, trying to look at who are the people who did the study, do they have any vested interests in one outcome versus another? And that could be money, but it also could be their pet theory that they have, right? So there are a lot of influences that aren't just money. I think that the extent to which the study is upfront about the limitations I always like it when I ask a scientist if she can tell me, what the critics would say, and she starts to rattle off like a long list of things, all problems with her study. Like, to me, that's a good sign, right? Like, the more somebody's aware of all the. I had somebody say to me once in answer to that question, like, "Oh, I can't think of a thing," and I thought,
"Oh, come on,
well,
yeah." there's just
that is
no
a red
way.
flag.
There's no
Yeah.
way. And talking to, I mean, one of my favorite things is also getting to talk to other people in that field that know about the study coming out. And sometimes you'll be really hot on a story and be like, this is so interesting, it's going to back up this whole piece of this other story I have. And then you talk to some other folks and they're like, that person's not even an expert in this field of research. Like, why are they publishing this study? And they like dig into it, and all of a sudden you're in this like weird little internecine like battle between academics, and it's kind of like, it's
although sometimes they really relish that stuff. I mean, sometimes, I'll ask researchers, who else in your field, do you think I should talk to? And sometimes they'll be like, oh, you should call this person, they're gonna hate this. You know what I mean? Like, so, sometimes people are very upfront about that stuff. But yeah, I mean, politics, science is a human endeavor. And so it has, all the best things and the worst things about human endeavors, like other human endeavors, like politics, like, whatever. And so there's a lot of interesting personalities and dynamics that go on there.
I have a couple of questions that I'd love to bring in, if you don't mind. One is from David Hassenauer, and I apologize if I mispronounce your name, David, but thank you for submitting this question. He said that he has family and friends that are skeptical of climate change, that it's human caused and a significant threat. He asks, what approach has the best probability of getting folks that have entrenched views against mainstream scientific consensus to potentially be open to better information? He used COVID-19 vaccines as another example. And I guess this would go to the science communication question and being critical of, giving people probably tools as well.
Yeah, I think that's an interesting question. I mean, there is a whole field on sort of countering, how to counter misinformation. And I'm not an expert in that, although I've definitely heard people talking about that. I mean, the absolute worst thing you can do is go in there with an attitude of like, everybody knows the truth and you're just wrong and you're stupid. Like, that's just not gonna convince anybody. It wouldn't convince me of something, right? But neither necessarily does like just a recitation of facts, right? And I mean, for me personally, I think about the fact that why do I believe the things I believe? Like, what do I put my trust in? And I think that I am putting my trust in sort of different groups, perhaps, but I'm still putting my trust in groups. And so when I'm trying to talk with people who see the world very differently, I often try to sort of get it where, I show some curiosity about where they're coming from, mm-hmm. and try to sort of share with them, kind of a little bit more about where I'm coming from, as a way of like trying to emphasize similarities between people rather than creating these stark mm-hmm. distance that seems unbridgeable. Do you know what I mean? So, I mean, in general, as a reporter, I have to talk with a lot of different kinds of people, and they're not always people I personally agree with necessarily. But I'm always just trying to understand where they're coming from and try to, show an interest in them. And I think that when you show an interest in other people, they are sometimes more amenable to you're sharing where you're coming from. That's not a very good answer, but I do not have a PhD in countering misinformation. There's like online, there's slews of guidance for that kind of stuff, but a fact recital is generally not an effective,
Yeah, I have some friends that vehemently did not believe that, just didn't believe climate was changing at all. And it's kind of, it's one of the things that I cover, and sent them whatever science article explaining the very basics of greenhouse gases, etc. And I think part of it broke through, but I think it could be really tough. And so I also sympathize with David, because it can be a little heartbreaking as well. I also want to shout out to Trina. Hi, Trina. It's thanks for joining us. Trina's great. So she asks, looking at fictional TV and movie characterization of your profession, which role / example do you think is the best? Like, do you have a favorite movie where a science person was science reporter?
A science reporter?
I don't
know. But I'll tell you, in terms of depicting the profession of reporting, I thought Spotlight was an amazing movie. It's not science reporting, but I think that it conveys the process of reporting better than any movie I've ever seen. Where, you've got this group of reporters who are trying to like learn about something, and they're just kind of like feeling their way. Like they don't really know. It's like they're talking to different people and weird things are happening, and they're looking for sources of weird information. And it's very much a sort of like groping process, like groping through the darkness kind of process. And I felt like they conveyed that pretty well. And they also conveyed the sort of sometimes obvious and subtle ways that pressure is brought to bear on news organizations, and also how news organizations screw up. Because the reporters in Spotlight were very clear that like they had overlooked this, these cases of abuse too, and because just the news organizations are just inundated with so much information that sometimes there's something that you should have paid attention to that you didn't because of your own blind spots or your biases, or you were busy or whatever. So I love that movie. I feel like I could watch that movie 1,000 times.
Louisa Rebel asks, do you have specific assignment schedules, like Tuesdays ATC will have science story, or is it more like you build up a reservoir, good to go anytime soonish, or evergreen as we call it, stuff that gets picked up by the shows depending on what time is available? It's a very specific question about mechanics of radio.
It is, but it's a funny thing though, right? Because until you're in it, you don't know. I mean, a lot of people, there's a funny relationship between the shows and the science desk at NPR, where the science desk kind of independently produces pieces, and then we sort of talk to the shows about them. It's like, I have this idea for a story. I'm thinking it'll be like maybe 5 minutes. Would you be interested? And if they're interested, it's like, well, when could you run it? We really need to run it by Friday. Are you going to have space on your show? And they're like, oh, sorry, we can't swing that. We've got like this, hearing happening. And so then you go to one of the other shows, to Morning Edition, and you're like, hey, would you have space for a 5-minute thing? And they're like, well, maybe we could, but it really needs to be more like 3:45. And so it's kind of funny. It's a weird negotiation. And the thing is, it's a real mix of things. Like there are days where you wake up and something has happened, and like you have to throw a story together like immediately, right? And then there's other stories that just hang around for a long time. Like you get the tape from reporting a trip, but then you're busy and you can't get to it. And it's like a year later and you finally put the piece together.
I had that happen last year because red flag season ended because COVID kind of kicked everything out of the way. And then I waited until the following red flag, kind of like when we have all a Santa Ana wind season. And we ran it, but it was strange. That does happen to us as well.
I think some stories have to mature like a fine wine. You know what I mean?
That's what I told my editor. That's what I said. Some stories.
And then there's all the ones in between, right? So there's features that are time sensitive, and there's features that are not time sensitive, but really, like, I think at NPR we are given an extraordinary amount of freedom to
Mhm.
find and pursue story ideas that are of interest to us. And what I always find fascinating among my colleagues is everybody has such diverse interests that, like, there are stories that people get so excited about doing that I would not want to do, and vice versa. And I love that everybody gets to sort of like, you know, follow their own kind of inspiration. I think it makes for richer storytelling to have people doing stuff that they're really excited about reporting on.
I think we should talk about, maybe we take a brief trip to talk about some ice worms. What do you think?
Sure.
Yeah, let's do it. Tony, if you don't mind queuing that up. So why don't we go ahead and, Nell, if you can, set the stage for us. What are we looking at on the snow? And then we'll fire, and like, where are you? And we'll fire the clip.
So this is hiking up Mount Rainier. So this is a story I did out of Washington State with a biologist who studies ice worms, which are these tiny black worms that live at high altitudes on the glaciers in the snow in huge numbers. And during the early part of the day, they live way down inside the glacial snow. And then in the afternoons, they come up in large numbers to do something on the surface of the snow. And so this story was me walking up this snow-covered mountain with this researcher who's studying these worms. And so basically up to this point in the story, we've just been like, you know, hiking up through snow, kind of like talking about worms.
We cross over a ridge and onto Paradise Glacier.
See them? It's happening. And so now you can start to, like, you just look out a little further and you can start to see them just dotting.
Thousands and thousands of ice worms have appeared. As we watch, their numbers rapidly grow and grow until there's dark flecks everywhere on the snow.
There is no hint of them trying to blend into their surroundings.
You don't want to step on them, but it's impossible not to. Hotaling thinks these worms must have some kind of impact on the world around them because a single glacier is estimated to hold more than 5 billion.
There are so many. Like from where we're standing right now, I can see 5, 6, 10 glaciers. And if every one hosts that density of ice worms, like that is just a massive amount of biomass that's in a place that is generally biomass poor.
So cool. That's really cool. How'd you decide the trip was worth it to head out there?
There's something about those worms that I found really compelling because there are so many of them. Like it is, you're out west and you look up at these mountains in the Pacific Northwest and they have glaciers on top of them. And like a lot of people do not realize that they are looking at like the realm of these worms. And the worms, what are they doing? Like, why do they live in ice? Like, why do they look like that? Like, so little is known about these things and they are so sort of lowly. But, you know, the piece I did was trying to make the point that like they actually are these incredibly weird, complicated little creatures living in the backyard of major metropolitan areas that most people don't know about. And they're seriously threatened by the glaciers melting. And nobody knows really what role they play in the ecosystem or what creatures are eating them or whatever. They've just been almost totally ignored. Although there is in Alaska, there is an annual ice worm festival, but I think that the ice worms are more just like sort of a mascot. It's not like they're not getting deep into the science of ice worms up there.
Deep frying ice worms.
Exactly. Yeah. It would not be they're so tiny. They're so tiny, like little inch long worms. Like if you were not looking for them, you probably would just think they were like crud or something.
So another listener question, Capri Maddox wants to know about public records requests, how they impact our work, and maybe how getting this information helps you provide transformative information to your listeners. Why don't you go first, Nell? And then I have probably some recent stories that I can reference that I could talk about.
I love public records requests, and I especially love public records requests at the state level, which I find to be sometimes more productive than
Yeah.
large federal agencies, although there are some large federal agencies that are actually okay, like NASA's okay. I believe it's in the public interest to have reporters looking for primary documents produced by and held by the government. And I think that it's pretty clear that the government has a legal obligation to hand them over.
Mm-hmm.
And so, it's really an important way of checking in on what these agencies are doing. And I have a general personal rule of thumb that if I try to talk to a public official and the public official won't answer me, or I feel like is dodging my questions, I just file a public records request, like every single time. Like, I just feel like it is a good sign that there's something there worth looking into. I'll do it to check in on agencies to see what agencies are doing, but I'll do it for individual scientists if they work at a public agency and it's of sufficient public interest.
Yeah.
I think it's really important. I think that reporters should use public records requests more. And, I think the reason they don't is because they worry they won't get a response, and they worry they won't have the backing of their organizations to do whatever legal battles need to be done. But I can tell you at NPR, we get huge support. I mean, the NPR lawyers are thrilled to chat with us about FOIA requests.
Yeah.
And they've like filed lawsuits on our behalf. And it's something that I think NPR takes really seriously as a public service and a responsibility.
Yeah, as does KPCC. And I will say we released a couple of investigations, one in August and another in September, the first having to do with basically California's heat standard, that we're one of the only states in the nation that has a heat standard for workers, how California's heat standard is basically failing to protect people in certain ways. And as the nation explores a heat standard, what not to do that California has done, we kind of looked into that. And we came across quite a few stories that we referenced in that through public records. And for the follow-up story to that, of firefighters getting sick, and some have died due to heat illness, not while on the fire line, but during training. The only way that we were able to prove that, because this wasn't something that we felt like even CAL FIRE necessarily knew was going on, was we received all of these kind of a Hail Mary towards the end of the project was every single one of their like assessment reports that they do every time someone gets sick. And we got a file with 163 different cases that broke them all down and said what happened. And it really shored up a lot of what we were already hearing on background from people, and let us then go ahead and reference those documents, and those documents really made the story and are setting us up for future stories as well. And so I'm a big fan of, my understanding is that California is pretty good. I'll find out. I have about 6 more requests in that I put in yesterday, and I'm hoping get them before like 2023. But it can be a little bit of a battle as well. And KPCC's lawyer, I believe, is, knows it's in the public interest and has our back as well, which is quite nice. So it just takes a long time. It takes investment, and what helps is if you find out, we found this out through a Cal OSHA PRA, we found out about a type of report with another agency, and then we were able to reference the name of that report. So before that, we didn't know it existed. And so one thing can obviously feed into another, and all of a sudden, you got yourself a story, and you're able to support what people are telling you. So I think they're supremely important. One of my favorite things, and I just wish all agencies moved faster. I don't know how it is on the federal level. I've heard it's not very good.
It's harder, they get tons of requests, but I've done public records requests with California Department of Public Health and California Occupational Safety and Health, and I've directly used that information in stories I've done. And the great thing about the Freedom of Information laws is that they apply not just to documents, but other types of records. And so audio reporters can get audio, we can get video, like I did a story about, that involved a workplace, and there were workplace inspections. Somebody was going around with their iPhone taking video of inside the plant. It's like the company would never give you that, but it's a public record and it can be produced if you've got a news organization that will back you when you go to get it.
And it's amazing how often, I'm not speaking to any one agency, but it's amazing how often people either feign ignorance, walk around questions, and then when you can go ahead and back up what, like I said, what other people told you on background with records, it's supremely important. It's really important. And we're also not the only ones doing it. Lawyers are doing it. Advocacy groups are doing it. There's some agencies that publish all their PRAs online so that you could see all of them. By the way, you could PRA all the PRAs if you wanted to, public records requests. So yeah, it is quite the tool. David has another question, which I will go ahead and ask. And actually, David, I'll get to it in a second. I do want to talk about this other story that you had, though, and I think it's really important to talk about in terms of the culture of science and what we do choose to focus on, and talk about some of the, I guess, some issues that do come up, especially when covering and talking about these fields, or talking to people in these fields. I think a lot of us hold scientists in quite high regard. I know I often do, but there are problematic aspects that do come up with the culture, including the limited number of people of color and women, at least, that are pushed forward by PR people, I would say, or like lead papers that then get pushed forward in the press releases. And you have to be very specific and ask for not just white guys all the time. And I was thinking about this because, one, it's a constant issue, but two, it's also, it came up in the story that you have titled "Controversy Over Scientist's Shirt Mars Celebration of Comet Landing." And I think we're going to play a little bit, and we have an image as well.
Oh yeah, should I set this up then?
Yeah, do you want to set it up?
Yeah, so this was from the European Space Agency had a mission called the Rosetta mission, which was a mission to land a probe on a comet. So during the landing, they had sort of a worldwide webcast where they were sort of live streaming. And this was a story about a controversy involving one of the main scientists for that mission, a guy named Matt Taylor, who's, he's a kind of like fun, casual guy. He's got a lot of tattoos, he has a tattoo of the Rosetta spacecraft on his body, So anyway, he appeared in a shirt that created some controversy, and then we covered that.
Before the lander made its triumphant touchdown on the comet, Taylor spoke about the Rosetta mission on the space agency's live webcast.
I've said it before, Rosetta's the sexiest mission that's ever been. She is sexy, but I never said she was easy.
As he said this, Katie Mack was watching. She's a theoretical astrophysicist at the University of Melbourne in Australia. She noticed that Taylor was wearing a brightly colored shirt.
And I looked closer and noticed that it was covered in women in lingerie, like cartoon women in lingerie, and that was the design of the shirt.
The buxom babes were provocatively posed and shooting laser guns. They looked like illustrations from sci-fi pulp fiction. Mack thought that Taylor's comments and his shirt were just not appropriate for a worldwide broadcast of a major science event.
To me, it seemed like it was really unwelcoming to women in science to have the lead scientist be wearing women as decoration.
She says, okay, it's just a shirt, but little things like this add up to a real problem for science.
It's not a big deal, but it's part of a big deal.
Yeah. I mean, I don't know in what world his comments or shirt would be appropriate, especially on on the world stage, and how polarizing and how he can make so many people feel uncomfortable with that kind of stuff. I was wondering, though, if you could speak to specifically the conversations that you're having, with folks. How often does this discussion come up in terms of support for women and people of color in the science world? I feel like there's been discussion about it, but I don't feel like there's been a true high level reckoning, in my opinion. But I'd be curious kind of what you've come across in your travels.
Well, I mean, just with that story, for example, I think Matt Taylor, he was not trying to be, sexist or misogynistic. He was just wearing what he thought was a fun, cool shirt to try to get people to see scientists as sort of like less buttoned down and more, sort of more like rock star kind of thing. And, he gave a very heartfelt apology about that. And I do think that these issues are being talked about more and more than I've ever seen in science before. I did another story about the sort of effect of the so-called dude wall. So these are these, you walk into a hospital or a science department and there'll just be like a wall of portraits of men. You know what I mean? And it's just like people who are trying to work there are like walking by. And if you're like, a young, like, Black researcher or a woman and, or someone from an indigenous group, like it just sends a message that like kind of science is done by these other people. And so I think there's like this real growing awareness of this and much more attention being paid to it. There's a lot of discussion about the Nobel Prizes, for example. So like how few women have ever won a Nobel Prize. This year, it was all men that won Nobel Prizes. And to me, it's important to cover because it's a conversation that's being had more generally. And I think that it speaks to science as a human endeavor that is just full of all the human problems that are everywhere else too. And I am not an exception to that. Like, so I've done, I do a lot of tracking of the people I interview. And a few years ago, I realized in looking at the people I interviewed that I was interviewing, the people who were appearing in my story were 75% men. And to me, that was a sign of a problem, like that there is sort of structures in place that when you're a reporter, you go to sort of like interview the lead author who may be a white male, and maybe you wouldn't interview the other authors of the paper who might be more junior, who might be, non-white or, female or whatever. And so I had to really stop and think about like, who am I interviewing for my stories? And is who I'm interviewing really representative of like all the people who are engaged in and doing science? Like there's some fields that are still very male dominated, but there are a lot of women doing this work too. And it actually isn't that hard to find women, studying, planets outside our solar system or whatever. So I really had to like look at myself and think hard and be like, why am I so lopsided here? Like, why are the people I'm interviewing so male and so white? And like, what are my own internal biases that are making that happen? And how is it affecting my science reporting and the stories I choose to cover?
Absolutely. Yeah, and we're having the same discussions at KPCC where we're tracking, every reporter and show is responsible for tracking sourcing, and that is absolutely the same. And we have a same sort of initiative going on. I do feel like what you said with the lead author being pushed primarily, oftentimes, it's the people that have been promoted, have been around for quite some time. And if it is a male dominated field and they're older guys, and they push the lead author, a lot of the time that lead author is going to be a older white guy. And so it's definitely worth, worth reaching out to the co-authors, of course, and all of that. And hopefully, I hope that changes over time, obviously. So what do you think that the public, I guess the ultimate question that I come to is like, what can the public do to make sure, and then maybe even hold journalists more accountable to ensure some sort of diversity in science coverage in the guests that we bring on? I want to know how to empower the public in this instance as well.
I mean, I think it's, it's worth calling people out, right? Like if if there's like a panel who are discussing something and it's like all, men or it's not representative in other ways, if it's a story about events happening somewhere and like all the people talking about it are, not from that area, but are sort of like, sort of like researchers from, US institutions rather than the communities that are being reported on. Like if those voices aren't there, I think it's fine to just write in and be like, what was that? I just heard your story on X, Y, and Z. And like everybody you talk to is like, sort of like an academic who's not part of this group that supposedly is being reported on, or why are you doing it this way? Or why did you not cover this? I mean, I read that stuff. Like I look at all that stuff. I take it very much to heart. And these days there's so many different ways you can, engage, like whether it's through online social media or Twitter or emailing people. I mean, I know I personally, like, every time I get any kind of communication from a listener, it's deeply meaningful to me because, I take it to heart, and I believe that at least the community that listens to NPR often has, the best interests of society at heart, and they want to make everything better. And so, I take it quite seriously.
So David, I'll get to David's other question that he has. And he asks, for radio especially, can the complexity of a really amazing science story impact the choice to report on it? And to that, I would say yes, absolutely. Depending on, not less so for the web, more so for radio, for me.
It depends, right? Because like even a very complex science story, you could tell it at many different levels, right? There's kind of like, if you think of the area as being kind of like a mountain range, like you can go through every valley, which would be sort of a long march, or you could sort of like, as a reporter, you could just like kind of touch lightly on each peak, right? You kind of have to make a judgment call about how much of the complexity is really important to the story you're telling. And if it is, then you got to include it. But if it's not, then maybe the listener doesn't need it, like if you're covering a sort of debate between two groups of scientists and the crux of their disagreement really requires going into, the sort of specifics of the studies or the complication of the science, then you got to. But a lot of times you don't need to go that deep. Sometimes I feel like a lot of my job is just trying to be vague without being inaccurate. Do you know what I mean? Like to write something in a way where people get the gist of it without having to know like every little detail. Because, a radio story is not the same as a scientific report. And even scientists, when they're talking with their, extended family over a holiday meal about their work, they are not including every little bit that they're putting in their, proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences paper or whatever. So you always have to make a choice about how much complexity to include. And if it's not pushing the narrative forward, then it's probably not a good idea to include it.
This is kind of a left turn. We're coming towards the end, coming up on the end of this, but I wanted to talk a bit about this too. I know you've done some climate coverage. You also do major, how you prepare a space mission that's going to exist for 50, 100 years, what have you. And which to me gets at like they're large existential, you end up in like a lot of existential questions, a lot of existential dread going on. I find that especially with the climate pieces that I do or the disaster pieces that I do. I'm curious from like an emotional standpoint and a reporter standpoint, how you end up handling stuff like that and how you end up processing, I would say if you're looking out at a climate report for the next 100 years, I can't say it looks great. Depends on which scenario you're looking at. And like, what do you do when you go home at the end of the day and sit with kind of some of this really, big knowledge that can be quite serious at times?
Well, I think there's two different kinds of existential threats, right? So there's stuff like climate change, which is super depressing, and if you let yourself, you could easily slide into despair. And I think those stories take a little work to talk about them in a way where people don't just shut off, you know what I mean? Where it's not just like so overwhelmingly bad that people just kind of shut down. They can't take in any information. And so, you have to sort of handle that challenge, like of finding a way to talk about these things really without making people sort of shrink back and just close their ears and try to tune it out because they feel so helpless, right? But then there's a different kind of existential story, which is just the existential threats that we all face as a consequence of being mortal human beings in the world. And those kind of existential threats, I actually think people want to hear about those, that they are interested in hearing about those, and that we don't talk about those enough. And because those are the issues that we all deal with, that it's not like it's anybody's fault. It's not like, there's any blame going around. It's just we're all limited. We're small beings with a limited lifespan. And so I find people struggling with that to be quite poignant, actually. And there are a lot of scientific questions that cannot be answered in one person's lifetime.
Mm-hmm.
And so there are, there are studies that involve scientists, laying the groundwork for people to find out things that they know they will never see. And I think there's something really beautiful in that. And I think that a lot of the challenges of planning these kind of like long-term experiments or a long-term space mission are kind of, they echo the kinds of problems that people have in their own lives, with aging parents, with their own aging bodies, with their children. And so I think that, all of that stuff is really relatable for people, but it's kind of two different things, right? It's like one thing people find overwhelming and they don't want to listen to. This other one, I do think it's also for some people overwhelming, but I think some people are really interested in listening to that because we all have to deal with that.
Yeah, absolutely. Definitely a lot of, I think that these stories can be quite overwhelming for a general audience. So I'm always kind of curious how fellow reporters process and deal with them as well. And so, I think it's particularly interesting. So let's see, we have a couple more questions. Do you have any advice for people that want to be, I mean, we've kind of gone through a lot of stuff, but do you have any general advice for people that want to be science reporters? Trina Ray asks if there is a young scientist today who might be interested in science journalist path. Are there programs like the one you described at Johns Hopkins that you know about? And yeah.
Yes, there are. The University of Santa Cruz runs one, for example.
Mm-hmm.
There's other ones in Boston and New York. And there is a group called the National Association of Science Writers that has student memberships, and I think almost anybody can join basically. And there are a whole slew of internships and fellowships, and sometimes people don't even have to leave the laboratory. So maybe they're just curious about science writing, but they don't know that they want to go do that. The American Association for the Advancement of Science has a mass media fellowship that's open to researchers. There's also, there's just a whole world of science writing that isn't just in the media. There's a ton of science writing that takes place at institutions. And I would say, there's a lot. I think that my career advice would probably be useless because I went into the field 25 years ago when the internet was not like a thing. And I literally got internships looking at fax machines and opening mail. And it's just a different world, so different. But I will say the one thing that is the same is that you shouldn't do it if you don't really like to write and to read and to talk to people, because that is like basically all you do. And so if you're just looking for an exit from science, it's not necessarily a good career path because it's highly competitive. Many outlets are not very well paid. There are, it can be a struggle, and if you don't love it, the struggle is going to be a lot less fun.
I mean, I think that a traditional staff position is especially tough in this day and age. I did speak to someone who was going for a geology PhD recently who was interested in science writing. And I do think that there are outlets, I don't know about making a living, but I do know that there are outlets that are hungry for people with deep knowledge in fields that are looking for inventive and interesting stories. And if you want to, she was debating whether to drop her PhD program and pursue science journalism. And I recommended she do both, because, and sorry about my camera, the lighting it's freaking out right now. But I recommended that she do both because I think that she could tell pretty quickly if she was into the idea of having to write long form pieces about geology or, I don't know what her expertise was in other earth sciences, but I think it'll also inform, like, you're not going to be bad off with having a PhD. and going into the field also, and being able to dive deep into some of these different science topics and really truly understand what the scientists are trying to, like, some of the probably more technical aspects, technical stories. And there are some people at like the New York Times and and like Nell's stuff where I think that you're all able to take looks at pretty advanced science and know what's going on. And I always think that's a good place to be.
I think there's a huge appetite for geology stories. Like, one of the top stories I did this whole last year was about the flipping of Earth's magnetic poles.
Mhm.
Like, the Earth is a giant magnet, and every once in a while the poles flip. Like, who could have predicted that would have been a huge story for us? But it got, like, it was one of the top stories I did all year, and it was like really kind of hardcore geophysics stuff. And like, but people are interested. People are interested in the world. It's actually very heartening to me how much people are interested in stuff of no possible use to them at all. It's just, they're just curious about the world, and they keep being curious about the world, even if they're doing something in their day job that has nothing to do with it.
I will also say that I think both Nell and I, it feels, are on fairly older traditional paths, I would say, right now. I do follow a lot of people on Instagram and TikTok and YouTube that do fantastic science work, like do fantastic talking about science and science education and reporting on their own. And like, I'm sure some of them probably make really good money, actually. I know you can on YouTube and stuff. And so it's not to say like go start social media. I just think that there are platforms, if you're truly interested in it, like there are also platforms that you can like have editorial control and potentially make good money. And also, I think that if you have an audience built in, you could also go ahead and turn to a publication and say, hey, like, let us work together. I don't think that's bad either. But I think it takes a lot of work and it's hard. So if anybody has any questions, you can always email me. I'm always happy to answer, talk about that kind of stuff. If you ever have any career question, if I could help in any way. So I think that's about, we've just about hit the end. So, and thank you to everybody sending in the chat saying thank you. And, I'm just really happy that we got to chat today. And I, thank you, Nell. And we've never had this long of a conversation, and I did really enjoy it. And I hope we get to have more of them in the future. So, I really admired your work for so long. So it's really a pleasure to get to do this.
Well, thank you. I mean, I really appreciate being invited, and I love talking shop, and I love talking to people about science journalism. It's been my whole life, really, for 25 years. And, I feel fortunate that I've landed in a place that has a commitment to doing science journalism, and that, has these relationships with our member stations where, we can all sort of like talk about craft and, work on stories together. And it's just it's a really, really, really lucky place to be. So thank you for inviting me. This has been great.
Yeah, of course. And also, just a side note for anybody who liked the Big One podcast, there might be a couple of you. We got a new podcast coming out in 2022, so stick around, and we'll put something out through LAS Studios, but we'll keep you updated on all the social media kind of stuff and make an announcement eventually. But yeah, thank you, and have a good night, everyone.